Patricia, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Scott.
Will the Future Like You is your new book, Reflections on the Age of Hyper-Reinvention. Will the future like you? Will the future like me? Will you like me after this conversation? These are questions that plague us constantly, right? As your book is so great. I enjoyed reading it so much, but I'm now so much more self-conscious than I already was about my self-consciousness, right?
Oh, there's a downside to awareness, you know?
So just for our listeners who have not read the book, which I'm assuming is all of them, although after this conversation, I hope this will change and hundreds, maybe thousands of more people will read this book. But I was reading, I forget who wrote this, when I read this essay, and they said that Augustine was the first person to really create an in-depth conception of the interior self in the West in the Confessions, right? Where he's just excavating all these motivations and why did I steal this pear? I didn't even like pears, but the other guys with me were with them and I wanted to do this. And then, so now we can't get through that through a day without conceiving of the interior self and the external self. But now you say there's another self, right? There's this persona out there because in the digital age, we don't just have, the walking around self in all these different contexts, which everybody has always had as long as we've been social, and the interior self that in the West maybe is overdeveloped. But we've got this other self that we're always projecting, this persona that we're projecting in all of these digital mediums. And this is at the heart of what you grapple with in the book, right?
Yes, because this is what is truly causing us the most unease and the most psychological complications. So I hatched this theory I write about in the book pretty early that is the theory of persona fog. Let's start with how Jung mapped the psyche. So there is, in Jungian theory, there is a core self. There is a seed of you that is inherent in you. And just like, there's a seed for an oak tree and there's a seed for a pear tree, and they grow into those trees.
So
and
we're rejecting here the onion theory a little bit, that we're just the sum total of our skins, right? That
yes.
You're saying, no, we're not just that. There's skins and there are layers, but there's something there that's real. It's not just the sum total of the layers.
Yes. And Scott, I'm so glad you brought that up because I have been tracking this culturally because that's my job. I'm a cultural analyst. I study the culture as if it were a patient. And I notice when things are sick.
That's card culture. That's like
I have plenty of material.
Comorbidities abound.
Right.
God. Where's the hospice?
I'm busy. I'm very
busy. Get the morphine going.
But here's the thing. This idea that we're simply our skins. This goes back to Lacan, and then it was amplified by Zizek. And Zizek is terribly popular right now, just like fantastically popular. And this is really just the theory that we are our
Some of my best
persona.
friends are Lacanian Zizek people. But
right.
I just had, my friend who comes on the show, Todd McGowan, who teaches at the University of Vermont. He's a huge Lacan guy. And this is, absolutely. So this is everywhere, right? The Lacan, the Zizek stuff is if you're in sort of cosmopolitan cocktail parties, this stuff is swimming in the water.
Yes, it is. It's culturally relevant, and it's especially culturally relevant to well-educated, intelligent men in their 30s and 40s. And so, because Lacan was very popular in college curriculum in those days. I mean, I tracked this down, where's this coming from? And so, I admire Lacan's work. I've read Lacan's work. He's a Freudian. I think it's interesting. This is my little sidelight on Lacan. Like many of the acolytes who studied with Freud demanded abject loyalty. And anybody who didn't deliver it, there was a ritualistic severing of the primal father relationship. And that happened to Carl Jung too. So it happened to Lacan. And so the thing is, Lacan really did believe that the external self is the self. It's what we've got. It's a series of performances. And Zizek took that further. And what I'm finding fascinating about that confluence of ideas is that it comes at an interesting time when technology, especially social technologies, finds that convenient, because those technologies and the people who invented them would prefer that you think that there is very little at stake for harvesting part of the self and using it for profit.
Hmm.
And so I may seem, being a Jungian these days. Well, there are two things about being a Jungian. First of all, there's been a big resurgence, and why that is, I believe, is because Carl Jung, and this is why what created the famous breakup between Jung and Freud was Carl Jung became an advocate for the soul, and there are people who I think are finding themselves somewhat soul sick
Yeah.
by the current society. It's not a very nurturing society for a lot
Yeah.
of reasons. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, so Carl Jung believes that there
When you
is.
said it's not the, I just imagine, like, Trump is all over the place, right, in our culture now, and I just imagine him going, "My people have the best souls. Okay, they're like they've got the most fantastic souls we have ever. I mean, beautiful. I mean, not like these liberals, lousy souls. We've got very strong, very powerful souls, beautiful souls."
Not bad. Not
Not
bad
bad
souls.
souls and not illegal. All documented souls. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, actually, what frightens me a little bit about that, first of all, congratulations. That's a great impersonation.
It's Basie. It's Basie. There's some. There are so many Trumps out there, Trump impersonators. And there are the guy in Saturday Night Live. I love. There's many Trumps you can do. I do the kind of Basie, throaty, gruff.
Well, I think you do the tired, older Trump. That's what it sounds like to me. But that's where you see, actually. I mean, that it's a good case study. And all persona, all external, no inner self, no marrow in the bone, of the psyche, as it were. It has a somewhat short shelf life. The future doesn't like that. And the thing the future does like about that, resident of the Oval Office, is that he does deal in compression, where he just can compress something down to its essence. And I think that's something we're all going to learn, not in the same ways. We're not going to wield it in the same ways, but how it helps the self is that once AI, and this is why I have some optimism about AI, once AI comes in and starts to take things off of our plates, the grunt work of the information society, we're going to have some time to really discover what matters to us and how we create meaning in our life. And that's a positive exercise. If you seize the moment and don't let that emptiness, that void fill with more digital slop. So anyway, let me just kind of really in a nutshell tell you about persona fog. Persona fog comes from when we are all performance. We have invented so many selves that live out in a variety of platforms, and they all have voices, and they're all slightly different, and we begin to identify with them. That's the clincher. We begin to identify with them. And then when they fail or something goes awry, or like, some influencers in the last 5 years, the algorithms have been reset 10. So you're one person, you're one guy, and you've really mastered that persona. And you wake up the next day and there's no one listening.
Mm.
That feels like failure. And how we then pivot is not to ask ourselves, well, what should I do now? Instead, we say to ourselves, who should I be next? So we're in this constant hyper-reinvention.
And this is the future, right? When you're talking about this looming, because it's an interesting title, right? Because it's a little abstract. And when you first pick up the book, Will the Future Like Me? Most people don't think of a future as having affective states. But that's great, right? It's will this? I mean, the future here sometimes seems to me like the ghost of Christmas future, right? I mean, in A Christmas Carol, right? This faceless thing that's like looming.
So there's some really interesting science around this, actually. That there are theories that the collective conjures a sense of future. That it is fundamentally a social construct that we all agree to. And there's some new theories coming out that say when there's abrupt or serious irrevocable change, that the collective will begin to dream a new future. So, I mean, this sounds out there for sure. But, Carl Jung believed that dreams are our closest access to the unconscious. So what's interesting right now, I think, is people are beginning to wonder if the path we're on is the future we want. And if we don't want that, then how do we get to something else? And so this is very hot in the culture right now. And it's a very good conversation to be having with yourself to say, which is why I wrote the book, what future do I want? And the first myth you have to break to get to that ability to conjure a future self is that you have to give up this illusion that what you put out there has no effect on who you are in
Yeah.
here. That's a
Yeah.
lie. And that's a convenient lie because it keeps you ignorant.
Yeah. You say something in the book when you're talking about persona fog, and you say there's these three bullet points you have in the beginning, these three facts that I think are just so salient. And you write in such these crisp, punchy sentences are so great. The internet is irresistible. Identity is increasingly built and rebuilt online. And then the third point, the first two sentences, our lives are externalized. Less is held within us. Right? This externalization of us, there's a cost to it, right? That there's something that happens to us, right? By the way, when I was reading your book, I think there are two kinds of people, right? And now you had to be wary of anybody that says there are two kinds of people, right? Well, then there's the kind of people that think there are only two kinds of people, or they don't, right? But I think there are people that think human nature is fundamentally a consistent thing over time. I would put C.S. Lewis in this category, right? Largely, the cultures change and stories change, technology changes, but largely being a human being is pretty constant. And then you have people like Heidegger, I think, that think, human being's a lot more fluid, right? What it means to be human is a fluid thing, right? It's not the same over time. And things like tools and technology and media and other realities and trauma can shape it. I think you're in the latter category, right? That human being is kind of a fluid thing, right?
Yes.
And I think what your book is arguing is that, wow, it's changing a lot
Yes.
because of the internet.
We are psychologically adapting. And I would say, this is my bold claim, I guess, that our next human adaptation is not going to be physical. It's going to be psychological because what we're in is unsustainable for lots of reasons. And people are copying to that now. And so, just like there was osmosis, we're bumping up against the ozone trying to get nourishment, and we're going to morph into something that is wired differently.
Can I read you one of your own sentences that I wish I would have written? I collect these sentences. I'm like, these are sentences I wish I would have written, and I have a list of them. And this has gone on the list. Today, the internet is a swarm of manufactured authenticity. I love that, right? Because that is what so much of social media is, right? This is so much of what I think Donald Trump is, right? I mean, because people say he's authentic. I don't know that he's authentic, but his sort of I'll say anything, I will break any taboo. It to me strikes me as complete manufactured authenticity, and this is everywhere, right? I mean, it seems like the internet is a factory for it.
Yes, it's at industrial scale now, and people who have been in the digital culture for long enough can spot it. We know a 3-camera angle when we see it. Like, oh, you're alone in Joshua Tree writing in your journal. I believe that's a 3-camera shot. You know what I mean? But the thing about authenticity, people toss that word around as if it's something easy to be had. And this is where we go back to the interior life. If you've completely lost touch because you're living through the persona, which by the way is the thinnest layer of the self. It is the most fragile. We're asking it to do the heavy lifting of the psyche now. It was never designed for this burden. And so no wonder we're fracturing under the pressure. And we're less able to, as we try to sustain that, we're cutting off supply to the core self. And it's filling us with this sort of emotional fog where we can't conjure a vision for ourselves. And this showed up when I was interviewing people who were otherwise successful. I mean, they didn't have self-esteem problems. They didn't identify as that. They had accomplishments, but they stumbled when I asked them to create, tell me about how you see yourself in the future. And they didn't, they really struggled to answer that. And that's when I began to see persona fog at work. Is it we are living so externally that there's no inner, it's not that that inner life or that access to we've lost access to it. The persona is attached to the ego. It arises from the ego. The ego will make everything a project of the ego. So it loves having multiple personas because it really keeps the ego in charge. That is not necessarily healthy. So it requires a lot of consciousness. And as Carl Jung said, every moment of consciousness is a defeat of the ego.
Hmm. That's beautiful. I was thinking when you were talking about these personas, right? And I was thinking of and how basically they become they're doing all the heavy lifting, right? I was thinking of the show The Americans. Do you know the show?
No, I don't.
It was about it's based on a real thing that the KGB had done pretty successfully. They had trained these folks from a young age to be infiltrating agents in the United States and Canada. And these people lived complete lives as Americans and Canadians. And they were complete, their accents, everything. They were fun. And this couple, and they're raising kids who are not aware that they're KGB sleeper agents. And you see them struggle with, especially the husband. He's really becoming more of an American. I mean, they're struggling. And because this percent, I mean, this dual life, right? It weighs on them, right? That they've been they've been targeted as children to be in this program of projected self.
Yes.
And that's exhausting, and you can see it in their lives, right? They're this couple is in their marriage, and their life is exhausting. Not just because they're KGB agents, but they're always they have no sense of who they are. The struggle of who am I really? Is the cover really my identity?
Yes. And that's what's the exhausting part, is you have to keep propping it up. It requires part of the psyche to be its own support system, and that draws energy away from, other parts of the self, which really have more merit and can do more for you. But I think what is so interesting about the premise, me having not seen it, is just how much a psyop it is to screw around with somebody's identity like that. And, part of why I wrote the book is when I realized that how we form identity, like the three legs of the stool, is one, how we see ourselves, two, how others see us, and three, our will to shape the self. Well, one and two have become the same thing.
Mm.
We're more reliant on our identity based on what the crowd thinks of us, right? And the third, I'm going to lean into James Williams, a former strategist for the future at Google, who revealed in a Guardian interview that the attention economy has been architecturally designed to reduce human will. So we are living in an environment that works against consciousness of the self. And then it's easier to trade because you don't feel like you have anything to lose. There's no there. It's all just, I can just pivot and recreate another persona, and this isn't costing me anything.
And the cost, I mean, what's interesting to me in the story you tell here is, on one level, late stage capitalism, modernity, pre-internet already has something, right, that most world history doesn't have. For most people, for most of history, kind of lived, worked, worshipped with, recreated with a similar group, the same group of people, right? Most people aren't Marco Polo and running all around. Most people are not Genghis Khan running around. Most people are pretty fixed in modernity. When we get mobile and cars and late stage capital, I mean, now I have one group of people I work with, one group of people I worship with, one group of people I play with, one group of people maybe my dating pool or something. But then the internet now expands this into this virtual world where now there's these spheres where I need personas for. In late modernity, I needed some more than most people needed. Now I can just willfully create them. I can go seek out new contexts all the time. And that just seems like we just have not evolved psychologically, right, to handle this.
Right, exactly. And this is where you see people having breakdowns because we're not evolved psychologically to handle it. And there's another layer to this. Two things. One is, there's Dunbar's law that no matter what the social structure is, we still can only manage about 200. It's the Christmas card list. We can still only manage about 200 relationships, and that bears out. I put my research up against that, and it bore itself out.
Yeah, I thought the number you mentioned in your book was like 150.
Yeah.
Right,
Well,
about
200 is the outside. 150
it's the outside.
is the sweet
It's the
spot.
normal.
Yep.
Right. So,
And-
so if 150 relationships, that's everything though. That's 150 relationships, coworkers, family,
Right.
synagogue members, PTA. You've got 150 cards you can put in your deck, and that's it.
Now the thing is what's happening is we have way more personas that we provide across those contacts, those relationships. And that's also exhausting. And then third thing I want to say about this, what you just said, is there's some really interesting work from Giddings about disembedding. That what you're talking about as certain social structures have dissolved. Human beings do this thing called disembedding, where we're no longer tied to anything. Traditions, rituals, identities that have been handed down. And so we're self-inventing everything. This is a huge burden on the self. When, just as you said, pre-modernity, a lot was figured out for you.
Yeah, you didn't. This is, I think, what most people don't understand, right? Because we just don't think about this stuff, right? Because who has time to think about anything, right? Because we're so busy and, and constructing personas and all this stuff. But I think you're right. But most people, the big questions: what's it mean to be a man? What's it mean to be a woman? What's sex about? What's a family? What's real? Are there gods? Why is there evil? All these things. These things are handed down to you, right? It's in the operating system, right? And so you don't have to. No, you could be a skeptic, or you could be a cynic, or you could be but even then, you've got stuff to rebel against, right? Just the having to do all this work all the time. In fact, I want to read you to you, because this is something when you talk about disembedding, right? You're working with Giddens here, and you say the psychological demons that chase us down typically meet us at a crossroads. Earlier societies had one thing in common when facing such a test: they sought divine guidance. These societies tapped into unknown forces, God's spirits, to help guide them. They believed in and built relationships with those forces through myth and communal rituals. Giddens suspected those practices bolstered their faith that a difficult passage could be safely traversed. It's hard to make your own myths.
Yeah.
Right? Most people aren't that creative. Most people just aren't that. Most of us don't have the time, the creative energy. I mean, these things, these myths, these traditions evolve over time because the stories prove that they're stories that are relatable and tellable, and people can embody and indwell them. It was Harari calls this our superpower, right? In Sapiens. But these stories are it's this combination of, you probably do have these prophetic figures like Moses or somebody or some, shaman or something that seeds some of these stories, but then the community evolves them and tells them and refines them, and the traditions evolve over time. So these things are stable. I mean, they might not be perfect, but that's a lot to do yourself, right?
Yes. It's more for the self to do. The self has to invent a culture full of symbols and myths. However, this is the good news. I mean, and this is why it's great to be a young
Tell us the good news, Patricia. Tell me something
good. The good news is that, first of all, the self has inherent intelligence. It's a inner guidance system, and it operates beneath the surface, whether you're paying attention to it or not. And it will give you symptoms that, it's signaling you with symptoms. So I talk about characters, people I interviewed in the book. Jeremy wakes up, he's an influencer, he's a web designer, he's got his fingers in a lot of pots, rubs his beard, and half of his beard falls out in his hands.
This story you tell in the book, I'm envisioning this, how scary this is,
Yes.
as I'm reading it, and just because it literally disintegration of the beard falling off in the sink is such a powerful indicator of what's going on inside.
Right. And this is his indication. This is the signal from the self. Something's very wrong. I'm giving you this symptom. Pay attention. Even though his story is kind of freaky, it's also, to me, hopeful, because it shows you what the self is willing to do to get your attention. And so he changed his life. And there's a great idea that Carl Jung had is, for instance, one of the signals the self can give you is a depression. And Jung believed at the bottom of every depression there is a task. And once you discover it, your life will move in a different direction.
That's beautiful.
And so there's Jeremy discovering something's really wrong with me. And he takes up the task to find out what. And it changes his life. And his life is, he has a happy ending. Anyway, I think that the other good piece of news is that we do have a collective unconscious, and it is full of symbols and myths and archetypes. But because we've lost touch with our personal unconscious, it's still there. We're not in communication with it. It might come up in our dreams. That is, if you're sleeping well, but it's still there. It hasn't gone anywhere. And part of how I know that, I still have kids come and trick or treat at my door dressed as Darth Vader. Darth Vader was an archetype.
He was the scare in the 1970s. That was the scariest villain
Right?
ever. I mean, it's so interesting because when you look back at the costume, it's still it's dated to some degree, but it's still terrifying.
It's still terrifying. And the biggest terror of all, the ultimate layer that gets put on it, is that he's a father.
Yes. Yes.
What could be more undoing?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. That's Luke's biggest moment.
Now, you say something too, that this is some more good news that you gave me in the book. That you say that over time, that you saw that with practice and repetition, people got skilled at creating masks that could evolve into truer expressions of themselves. This helped them expand into new dimensions of their personalities. These experiments deserve our optimism. Mastering social media in this way levels the playing field. That's really interesting. This is sort of the fake it till you make it kind of thing, right? That sometimes the personas can actually get in dialogue with the self.
Yeah.
And there can be some integration, right? Instead of disintegration and Jeremy and the beard falling out, that some of these personas, these ways of being in the world and even interacting in digital world can actually get us but this takes a level of attentiveness, I think, that is a stretch for most people.
Well, yeah, you have to wield these experiments with the consciousness that that's what you're doing. You're experimenting. You're not getting attached. You're not over-identifying. Where people get into trouble is they over-identify because they get the results. I mean, that's the dopamine hook. And then, when the algorithm resets, now you have intermittent reinforcement that goes back to Skinner. You can really get somebody addicted when you take away the bait and the treat. And so, look, let me talk about Janet. She taught me so much. She was 16 when I found her. I found her on Tumblr, and she was the one who took on the experiment. After she had a sort of crisis at 19, she had all these personas, she had all these archetypes, she had all these, she was very active on multiplayer games, and she had a lot of personas. And she found that what she started to do is anything that didn't get high scores, a lot of attention, she would eliminate that part of herself. But that was really kind of part of who she was.
Yeah.
So she was curating a self based on what worked. And then had to write an entrance essay to get into college, and told me that she felt empty. And this kind of freaked her out. She didn't like that feeling. And so she did a couple of things. One is she did a quick audit. She just chose the personas that she liked, that felt true to her. And then she reclaimed the ones that were true to her but weren't popular, and said, I don't care. That's still part of who I am. I'm going with that. And then she wrote about how she envisioned herself, who she wanted to be when she got out of college. What was this going to do for her? And she tried on a couple of personas to just say, hey, what would I look like as that person? But she knew what she was doing and why she was doing it, and that made all the difference.
When I was reading your book, I thought of this Christian biblical scholar and kind of popular theologian, N.T. Wright. He's in England, and I heard him give a talk once, and he was explaining a kind of Christian conception of identity. And he said, you hear people say when somebody's had a debilitating disease or something that they're a shadow of their past selves. But he says, no, what the truth about us is that we're really shadows of our future selves. There's this future of wholeness that we're growing into. I thought that was, when I was reading your book, I kept thinking of that quote about this future that you can choose, right?
Yeah.
And through these through an integrated relationship with the personas, when I'm conscious and mindful about what's going on, I can become more. I'm a shadow right now of that, maybe a future self that's more healed and more whole.
Well, see, shadow's a really important high utility word. That's how we do get whole, is by recognizing our own shadow material. And instead of repressing it, which the internet is really good at, anything that we don't like, we can repress. It only empowers it and kind of poisons it until it reclaims you. It'll seek your attention one way or another, usually in a very negative thing, in a very negative way. And and Carl Jung would not tell you to excommunicate that shadow material from the self. He would say, acknowledge it, understand as part of who you are, and then become more whole as a result of it. Become a different person through the knowledge that it exists. And what I think as a culturalist is so fascinating and probably a little overdue is that America is entering its middle age. It's
Mm,
entering the age when it needs to grow up and stop pretending it's a teenager and understand that we have some shadow material.
mm.
And by tearing plaques off walls and putting up different plaques that, keep replaying the Beach Boys theme song is not how we're going to get to be a whole civilization.
I want to read you something that I also was thinking of when I read your book. This is from a book called The Afternoon of Christianity, and he's using Jung's metaphor of the afternoon of life. And this guy's name is Tomas Halik. He's a Czech Catholic and psychoanalyst and a priest. And
Mhm.
he says it's only when one has passed the tests of the noonday crisis. For example, when one is able to accept and integrate what one did not want to know about oneself and did not want to admit to oneself, that one is ready to embark on the journey of the afternoon of life. But one can squander this new stage of life by filling it with the mere continuation of morning activities, by continuing above all to forge one's career and achieve financial security, by dusting off and improving one's image in the eyes of others, by chasing honors and applause, by pinning more and more glittering orders on one's breasts. One's persona can become so inflated that it eventually suffocates one's inner life. Even success has its pitfalls, and career and fortune can become a trap. And then he says, for Jung, completeness does not mean flawlessness, but wholeness. It's just a great metaphor. And he has a lot of insights about what you say. I mean, this kind of, I heard what made me think of this is what you said about America. And because he's thinking Christianity needs to grow up, that the Enlightenment and secular age, now we're in the post-secular age, all this stuff. He's thinking that Christianity has an invitation to evolve into its afternoon here. And I think what you're saying is maybe America has an opportunity
Yes.
to gracefully enter into its afternoon.
And it's so interesting. Yes, it's exactly what I'm saying. I loved what you read, by the way. And it's interesting that here this priest kind of came at it in a similar way, is to talk about persona and our over reliance on it is actually keeping us immature, not only as people, but as a civilization, as a society. And so what's interesting though, in watching sort of the communities react to certain policies is that they are definitively saying, no, that's not who we are. That's who you think we are. We decide who we are.
Hmm.
And we decide that collectively. And it's what I'm finding fascinating is how threatening that challenge is when parts of the body politic say, no, no, we decide who we are. There's a lot of power to that.
Yeah, I want something else. I want to read that you said about this. Yeah, just the shadows and the darkness and the struggles and the suffering of life. You say turning private grief into public performance walks a dangerous emotional line. Yes, vulnerability makes a person more relatable, yet the performance separates us from the felt emotion of whatever transition we're navigating. Holding our emotions at arm's length for a selfie rather than feeling our way into and through them is one of the ways the persona betrays us in the virtual world. That to me is amazing. I mean, it's become a joke on the internet now, but right, you think of like, oh my gosh, I've never seen a widow live her best life like Charlie Craig, Erica Kirk, right? I mean, this public grieving has become, I mean, it's awful. It's awkward to watch, right?
Mhm.
This living out of her loss in this politicized, it's infotainment way. I mean, it's uncomfortable to look at.
Well, and that's the good sign, is that manufactured authenticity tells on itself because it's not resonant. It doesn't feel true. So people reject it as truth, and they see it as a performance. And once your authenticity game is sniffed out, you're really done. There's n- there's no real recovery for that. I mean, I guess you could prostrate yourself and, in front of the masses and beg forgiveness, and maybe that would work, but it does taint a person, I think, on the internet, to be sensed as being totally false in something that is so humanly poignant as, a tragic death of a spouse. Those are high stakes moments for people. This business of, I have witnessed in my time, I was there, I was early to the game, I was just 30 something and was in the right place at the right time. And so I got to work with Al Gore's office on internet policy, and I got to work with Vitten Cerf, who's known to be the father of the internet, on a project. And I've been watching, and I've watched certain people also get chewed up and spat out, people like Heather Armstrong, who quite famously offed herself. There's a woman I interviewed on my podcast, Young in the World, who lived out as her persona, not herself. It was kind of foisted on her. People really liked her persona and they didn't care about who she really was, even though she
Mm.
admitted it. She copped to it. So she started living this persona for 7 years and ended up in a psych ward under watch for self harm. It was very costly emotionally. And so how we confess, how we reveal ourselves for the sake of audience numbers, becomes very poisonous to the self. And it is how we get betrayed in the end. And it's a betrayal that some people don't survive, actually.
Hmm. You talk in the book about self-doubt, which I found super interesting. And you say that there's a kind of natural suffering that occurs with disappointment, right? It's okay to be sad about sad things. You're inevitably going to be sad about something sad. Then there's neurotic suffering, which is uniquely human, right? I mean, I don't think like giraffes or dogs or anything do this. Neurotic suffering is a reaction to the above. We get anxious, dwell on it, and look for a quick fix to escape suffering. And then you say there's creative suffering when we actively set out to grow from our setbacks, right? Where the suffering becomes something that can can be actually a tool or a bridge into a fuller self.
Yes. And this is another moment of good news. People don't like this though very much. So I'm gonna put the disclaimer out front. I get asked a lot as interviews wrap up. So Patricia, what are the 3 things we can do? What are the 10 hacks you've got for fixing all this? Excuse me.
I'm not going to ask you that. I promise.
Good, because this problem is more profound than that.
Exactly.
It's personal and it's social at the same time. So it's in the culture. So, but the good news is we can grow out of it. And that's why what you just quoted from the book, this idea of committing to your own growth, is the best thing you can do. And that starts with awareness. And it starts with accepting that you have shadow material, and so do other people. And once you do that, maybe you can stop projecting your shadow material onto other people. And what would be the common parlance for that? Own your shit, right? Can you imagine how different the world would be if people owned their shit?
Yeah, and I think there's something. I have some friends who run an organization called Mockingbird. It's a religious organization where they do a lot of cultural analysis, and they're very interested in sort of trying to find grace and space for grace in the culture. But they use a term called low anthropology, and they say our view is we have a pretty low anthropology, right? We have a pretty low estimation of the human being. That they mean not that people aren't aren't worthy of love and respect, but they mean that we're probably pretty jacked up. We're probably, they believe in original sin, that we're tainted, we're raised by sinners and broken people, we're flawed people. And actually, they would say, and I agree with this, that they would say that when you accept that, you're not just more gracious with yourself, but you're more gracious with other people
Yes.
because you assume they're a mess and you're a mess interacting with another mess. And
Yes.
you're sure that never impute utter malice to something that could just be a really struggling day or blood sugar or other problem. You give people more space to be messy.
Yes. And this is a heightened form of consciousness, is to understand that. Like people spend a lot of money trying to get more conscious when actually something like what you quoted from low anthropology is is really available to anyone who wishes to grow in that direction. And I think what we're going to see as the people who not only survive but thrive in the future with AI are the people who have ripped out of their lives either things they don't need to spend their time on, but what they have reclaimed is their consciousness. And there are two kinds of consciousness. And I remember this afternoon like it was yesterday when I sat down on a spring day with Mike Csikszentmihalyi, who had written the theory of flow that was huge in the late 80s. And he studied consciousness as being droplets of just our awareness, what we're paying attention to. I'm paying attention to this. My attention, it's a form of awareness. That awareness is a form of consciousness. And then there's heightened consciousness. You know that moment. Everyone has had one, I believe, especially by the time you're an adult. Sometimes you have it as a kid. I remember I had it as a kid. And you get a sense that, oh, there's something bigger in this wider
Mm.
world. There is a power, there is a life force, and you are of that. And so is everyone else. And it's profound. I didn't even have a two-wheel bike at the time when I kind of got my taste of this. And so his concern about the internet age, this was 2 years before he died, was we were donating droplets of our low-grade consciousness, which is attention, and it was depleting our ability to sustain higher-level consciousness. And that trade-off was invisible to us. I think there's truth to that.
Yeah, and this is where, spiritual traditions, right? These things like meditation, different cultures across time have figured out that this higher consciousness you're talking about has to be cultivated, right?
Yes.
It's not something that just happens like digestion or something.
No, it's
It,
kindled.
it, yeah,
It's kindled
yes.
like kindling a fire. You're putting little sticks in to feed the fire.
I want to read you something else you wrote that you said the problem of the fragment itself is not new. And we talked about this earlier like modernity. And the fragment, this is not a new concept, right? Especially in late modernity, fragmentation's all over the place. But the internet puts a unique spin on the fragmentation of the self by helping us hide shameful parts of ourselves through compensation, where we replace the negative, ugly bits with those more pleasing to our audience. Using avatars and endlessly revisable profiles, we compensate by cobbling together a new facet of our persona to take the place of the repressed parts of ourselves, something built for expediency and validation. When we don't receive the validation, it can feel like an undoing. Over time, the search and replace strategy, I love that strategy, accumulates to self estrangement or dimming of identity, as psychologist James Tobin called it. He first noticed the phenomena in 2017 when interviewing college applicants for his alma mater, and later it showed up in his private practice. He describes it as a rudderless, chameleon like tendency to self center, to win approval of an audience. And that's the thing, right? It's not as though winning approval of an audience is a new thing in human history. The idea that everybody has an audience all the time through the internet, right? That we're all performing all the time. That is a new phenomenon. This is where human being is changing. Everybody that's got a Facebook account or Instagram or something, they're performing all the time. Everybody is now an actor.
Yes. Now, here's the deal. It takes us back to where we started at the top of this interview, which is this idea, this Lacanian idea that we're just all these performances and all this, like that is the self, all these performances. And Zizek amplifies that philosophy. What's interesting about Carl Jung is he was a medical doctor and he was working with patients one-on-one. And then he turned his gaze to himself after the bitter breakup between him and Freud. He actually, the Red Book is about him going deep within himself and actually confronting his own soul. He calls to his soul and says, I lay down my weapons. I lay down my personas, as it were. And I await instructions. What do you want of me? And that takes him on a journey into what became depth psychology. So why I critique Lacan's work is I appreciate its rigor, but it doesn't help people grow. I think it's met with its cynical moment in the digital age. And I see how this idea that, there's no there, so why worry about what we're squandering? I think the future wants people who aren't ego-driven, wants people who have some depth, wants people who can give and take honest and meaningful critique and not crumble. People who are not emotionally fragile, because that's what living out of the persona makes you, because it is fragile. And it's people who can command a moment by genuine problem solving. This all requires a great deal of character, as it turns out. And that doesn't come from nowhere. The persona doesn't beget that.
It's interesting. As you're talking, I think of this book called Failure of Nerve by Friedman, who was a rabbi and a psychotherapist. And he says that it's all about leadership in a chronically anxious age. And he says that empathy isn't the big thing leaders need. He said, because everyone's chronically anxious. And if you're too empathetic with the crowd, you're going to mirror their anxiety. He's like, the biggest work for the leader is to be in touch with their own emotional state being. And that will lead to the inner calmness and a command of your own self that can then lead in a chronically anxious age, right? That too much leadership is people not doing the work you're talking about and then just mirroring back the anxiety of the crowd.
Right. Or because mirroring the anxiety of the crowd also creates a certain kind of emotional burnout. They're just going numb, like the patients that psychoanalyst describes, teenagers sitting in front of him kind of vacant and slack-jawed about their own development because it's easier, not because something is broken in them. They're in a broken container. And that's why I wrote the book. I wanted people to understand there are limitations to what this digital world can give us and what we want from it. And we should be clear on both.
Because there's no going back.
No, you can tap out, do it all the time. You can put yourself on a diet. That's useful. But, speaking of diet, it's just like giving up food.
You're going to eat.
You're going to eat.
And we live in this connected world that unless you're Amish or something, which you could go off the grid or something, but most people are going to have to deal with it rather than avoid it. Yeah, you write something you write in the book that I found fascinating. You're talking about widows and trauma victims, and you say failing publicly is painful, but the lessons stick. One lesson is about how to recover from a crossroads that goes badly. Psychologist Roxanne Cohen-Silver runs a lab that studies adaptivity and coping. After interviewing grieving widows, victims of natural disasters, and those with traumatic childhoods, she found that most people, 2 out of 3, reflexively look to the past for a reason to explain their current misfortune. A minority of cases told a different story. Among crisis victims, 1 out of 3 do not attribute their current circumstances to their past trauma. More intriguing is Silver's next finding. They also recovered sooner. The stories we tell ourselves matter.
Yes. And this is the therapeutic culture that Christopher Lasch, the social historian, saw coming. He wrote a little bit about it, but we're seeing it play out fully now in the digital age. That we live in a therapeutic culture, and so when something goes wrong, there's a therapeutic answer to why something went wrong. However, we are now going to go through tectonic change with the rise of AI. I think everybody agrees on that. Some things are going to be shed and some things are going to adapt, and people aren't clear which is which or which will be which. And so there's going to be, some broken crockery. There are going to be pieces to be picked up. So this idea that one needs to traumatize every situation of change and externalize it as a story of traumatic experience. So trauma with a lowercase t is a way to put the psyche in a mode, keep it immature, keep the self immature and not growing because we face realities. That section also talks about a village where people die, men especially die of heart attacks at extraordinary rates. So people are dealing with the tick-tock of impending doom. How do they cope with that? The first thing they do is accept that that is just part of their reality.
Yeah.
And so we are going to be faced with a future where there's going to have to be a lot of reality adaptation. And we're not going to get that and benefit from it by creating a trauma story around it.
It's so interesting. Ezra Klein had on his podcast a few months ago, Ben Shapiro. And Shapiro has this new book out, prominent conservative, and it's about personal responsibility. And he said, well, I found your book very provocative and interesting, but, you're kind of a man without a country here politically because both sides, the left and the right, are just grievance politics so often,
Right.
right? It looks different on the left than it does on the right, but both are saying the problem is them or this thing, and elect me, and I'll get back at your grievance. I mean, and it's not a politics that nurtures the kind of acceptance of hard things,
Right.
right? I mean, I remember somebody saying, a guest on this podcast once said, he said, what, in 2008, Barack Obama and John McCain had in common. They both looked at manufacturing jobs and said, not coming back. that we got to adapt to this change, that we're not going to make things the way we used to in this society. Just 'cause, and now we've rejected that, right? But we don't tell that story anymore. That we imagine that we can go back, that we can make things great again. And it's just interesting, this the power of not looking back at the trauma or not villainizing something or not having this thing that is the master controller of the story it's so interesting.
So this trauma narrative that is really what the grievance narrative is, that certain people have been traumatized and deserve special treatment as a result, that it will be very hard for the people who believe in that to let go of that, right? It's a shield. And I think that's where this American culture has some work to do in understanding that's shadow material in there. The other thing about shadow material is when you're not aware of it, you can be manipulated by it because you'll do anything to protect it. You'll do anything to keep the crazy ant in the basement. And
What do they say? We suffer with our secrets, right? We're prisoners of our
yes,
secrets.
yes. So there's something, and there's something nuanced in here that again we can grow out of, but it starts with being aware that it's one of our boogeymen.
You wrote this book as your marriage fell apart.
Yes.
What shadow material was there? I mean, because dealing with divorce and you talk about having to find a place that there's a very moving story where you're sort of processing just having to find housing and moving and all this stuff. I mean, what did you come to know about you that you had to familiarize yourself, that you had to get intimate with, that maybe wasn't comfortable?
Oh, that's a deep question. So I think we continue to learn from the relationships that are important to us and go awry, and that was a very important relationship. It was based on love and a lot of optimism, and we had 2 children together. By the way, the good news is we treated each other with the utmost kindness through the process. We had 1 attorney. I remember sitting across from each other with a legal pad and saying, "Do you want the red rug?" "I don't know." "Yeah, okay, you can take the red rug." It was very humane. I'm proud of us for that, and we still are delighted to see each other. So we went on and built lives. But be that as it may, at the time, what I was having to confront is this idea that I could fix things that weren't mine to fix. And there's some ego involved in that. And I had to face that. That was shadow material. And I had to see myself as someone who could really, on a good day, maybe fix some of her own things, but I couldn't take on somebody else's portion, nor should I. And there was an arrogance to that. And I had to face all that.
The opposite of love is control, right?
Yes. Yes. And when we try to take over the work of someone else's growth, that's a lot of dominance. That's the underbelly of that behavior, is the desire to dominate.
Are you a fixer in general? I mean, did that play out in other relationships, or was that primarily in the marriage where you felt like responsibility? Like, I want to fix, I want to do someone else's work for them. Do you find that tendency happens in other relationships?
Well, it's good to be, in a conversation with somebody who asks questions some ways better than my own therapist. Thank you. But it's a little spooky too.
I
I'm
don't
not
take
gonna lie,
insurance.
Scott. It's a little spooky.
I don't take insurance, Patricia.
Okay, okay. Well, then here we go. With that in mind, so yeah, I was a fixer, and there's some, family system stuff here. My
Yeah.
mother was an immigrant from Ireland. My father was a very hard working. They were both hardworking. My father was a hardworking coal miner's son from West Virginia, and he moved north, and they met in Detroit in a factory, and he moved up the chain in General Motors. He was primed for management, and at 40, he had a massive heart attack and died, and our whole lives unraveled, and I was the oldest daughter, and in an Irish Catholic home, that means you're the oldest, so you learn how to fix things like the washing machine. You know? Like, you learn how to do things. You learn the difference between something that looks like a bill when it comes in the mailbox and something that isn't, so you can put it in front of your mom so she knows she's gotta pay it. Like, yeah, I was a fixer. I was and then here would be the Jungian moment of realization. I over-identified with that self.
Mm, One of my dear friends said to me years ago, it's one of the deepest bits of wisdom anyone has ever shared with me. He said, "You need to learn where you end and the world begins." And there's not a week I haven't thought about that. I mean, I don't think about it every day, but there's not a week that goes by in my life where I don't think about that. Those words he said to me, and this is what it's so easy to over identify, right? To try to fix, to make someone else's issues your issues, their shadows your shadows.
Oh, yes, and as women, we have been socialized to do that from the spirit of care, and we get a lot of kudos for that. We get support from being that kind of woman, but it doesn't change the fact that everyone is really walking their own program. Their self is emerging from the seed and becoming the tree that it's meant to be. So, who do we think we are?
You say in the book, in the end of the book, you say that you're trying to summon into being a new metabolism for the self, a metabolism that holds the uncentered bits in a wholly fluid suspension so the multitude of self states can work, even if we can no longer be whole in the old ways. Because right now, the fragments tumble and clank around inside us. Any transcendence to the best version of ourselves is impossible to contain when we're like this. And then you say, a little further down on that page. I love this, and this is just powerful. I remain convinced that the spiritual task of humanity right now is to reclaim the part of us that the modernist mindset devalued, the soul. Mind you, the task isn't metaphysical, it's practical. Having a vague idea of the soul isn't enough for the existential ordeal we're living through at this moment in history. We sense down to our fingertips that something is missing. The soul, I mean, getting back the soul. I mean, can you do it without the metaphysics? I wonder. Can you, like, I mean, I hear what you say about the practical part, but I mean, do we have to believe in something that we can't distill into a formula or reduce to a chemical equation or something? I mean, how do we do this? How are you doing it? How are you cultivating your soul?
Okay. I'm a writer. I wrote that. And the book I'm working on now is the same journey. It takes me by surprise often that it is its own form of individuation, which is when you consciously say, okay, I'm gonna deal with my shadow material, and I'm gonna become more aware of the totality of me, of the wholeness of the self. And I'm gonna live out of that. I'm gonna insist on it. And so part of what happens is when you decide to live like that, your creativity gets engaged, your imagination gets engaged. These are, by the way, the attributes that make us most human and that robots cannot replicate. But when I wrote that chapter, I have to tell you, my editor was like, "What is this? This is like, where are you going with this departure about we're going to evolve another feature of the psyche that's gonna help us stay whole?" And I'm like, it just came out of my fingers, and it had so much power. I have to defend it. It has to stay, and I don't
Yeah.
know who it's gonna help. But I think it's first of all, I wanna thank you for picking it out because it's exactly what I wanted to happen, is the people who needed to read it would read it and say, "I don't know what this moves in me, but it feels true."
It's wonderful, and I love this evolving the new psyche because it does these days, I think I'm on the Heidegger side, right? Where I think that human being is kind of a fluid thing, that it changes. Our conception of what it means to be us changes with the tools and the culture and the technology and stuff, and so but you give us a hopeful vision that we can grow into the future self,
Yes.
that we can develop new muscles, that we can develop new skills, that we can relate in a way that integrates rather than
And
disintegrates.
this is the difference between self-help and development, self-help and growth. Growth is about attuning yourself to it, wanting it for yourself, and being willing to do the things that might otherwise be uncomfortable in order to achieve it. It's like it's like if you've had a kid who needs braces, you could say, "Well, why don't what are the hacks for that with the braces situation?" There are no hacks. There's the braces, and the teeth are gonna grow in a different pattern.
Yeah, yeah.
That's what this is.
I love something that you say, like one of the shadow selves, one of the false selves is the optimized self. I just read this long post. I want to do a podcast about it. One of the other podcasts I do with Tim Ferriss. I'm sure you're probably familiar with
Yes.
this performance guru. Yeah. We basically wrote this long form post about basically rejecting what he's been working on. That basically the optimized self, this self hacker, that he doesn't know that all of this work has made him a better person. And all of this and just wariness of the self-help culture that he's been at the center of, right?
Mhm.
And he's sort of the poster child for the optimized self, right? But I love when you say that self-help and growth aren't the same thing,
Right.
right? That these are different, that the latter is much more substantive, right?
Yes, and that is the work that we're being called to do because the actual work that's needed does look like growth. It doesn't look like hacks, but I mean, I think the thing that I found so fascinating is again because I'm a culturalist, I had to go back to the history. Like, how did we get on this path of self help? And that's where I uncovered this story about this scientific attempt to create the perfect child.
Mm,
Right? We're going to take kids out of orphanages, infants and we're in these home ec programs in universities. We're going to put these mothers, 5 a day will be assigned to the child. They will be given, rigorous diets and sleep times and, this whole formula for making a perfect baby, growing a perfect baby. And the one thing that fell apart was the inconsistency of the mothers, that it turned out to be too much change to have all these different mothers in a day, and that's what the infant needed most, was the consistent love from a consistent mother figure. And this is where so much help goes awry because it can either oversimplify something or it misses a fundamental. And I appreciate the beauty of self-help. I've benefited from some of it myself. But I don't think that's our moment. And maybe Tim Ferriss would disagree with me, but that would be a great debate to have.
well, I think actually I mean, it's interesting because I think this post, it sounds like he was moving more in your
Yeah.
direction. That after all this self-help, he's kind of reevaluating how good it has been for him and how good it's been for the self-help optimizing culture, how good it's been, how much good he's done in the world advocating and stuff. It's really reflective for somebody at that point in their game to
Mhm.
say, to stop and say, I wonder if I've got it wrong. I'm always impressed when anybody can do
Yes.
that, when anybody can backtrack.
When they've yes, when they put at stake the very persona that has helped them succeed, right?
Yes,
But the optimized self, it has a history, and that history is that we can be fixers of the self, and we can
yes.
control outcomes for the self. And we can, through a certain set of strategic moves, humans can take control of our inherent growth, our ability to grow and manipulate that for a better outcome. That's what the self-help movement really sold us on.
Well, I'll tell you, your book, it's the opposite of self-help, right? It's throwing the light on the real possibility of healing and growth and wholeness, and
Thank you.
I'm better for reading it.
Thank you.
So, thank you so much for writing it, and thank you for spending some time coming on the podcast to talk with me about
It
it.
was a pleasure, Scott. Thank you.